Welcome to Woodsman Hill for my review of Silent Hill. And when I was watching this for probably the 6th or the 7th time the other night, I thought it'd be a good time to review it because I've always thought of this as a very new, modern horror film, but for the first time on my most recent viewing, it's stopped feeling that way. I mean, it's 15 years old now. It came out in 2006. It's a film which is starting to drift towards the past, so I thought, you know what, I'm going to do a review for it, maybe convince some people who've never seen it before to give it a try, or if you've maybe seen it once when it first came out, give it another try, because I think this is one of the most underrated video game adaptations out there. I think it's one of the most underrated horror films, period. I mean, last year, I put together a list of my top 100 horror films of all time, and Silent Hill came 7th. That's how highly I regard this movie. I don't know why it didn't really catch on with people when it came out. It only scored 32% on Rotten Tomatoes, and I suspect the audience score for it would not have been much better. I think the fact that the plot is quite complicated probably contributed to that feeling. I mean, this is almost like the Total Recall of horror films at times. People generally prefer something more easily digestible when they go to the cinema to watch a horror. But more than that, this film is very CGI heavy. Now, these days, that's not a big deal for most people. It's sort of ingrained in our film watching culture. But back in 2006, even though CGI had been used for quite a while, even back then, it was still sort of early enough in those days for there to be a little bit of pushback against films which used CGI a bit much. And Silent Hill certainly did lay it on quite thick in that department. In terms of a plot synopsis, this is a difficult one for me to give you if you've never seen this film before, but I will give it a go. So there's a couple called Rose and Christopher, and they've got this daughter who is sleepwalking a lot. And while she's sleepwalking, she mentions this town called Silent Hill, and this all comes to a head one night when Sharon walks so far out of her bed that she almost falls to her death off the side of a quarry. So in desperation, Rose decides to take her to Silent Hill to see if it will bring Sharon out of her stupor. But the trouble is, Silent Hill is not actually an active town in the story. It's a ghost town. It was abandoned many years ago. There was some sort of fire which broke out, and the fire spread throughout these abandoned underground coal mines or something. The whole town had to evacuate. It sounds a little bit silly, but there's actually a real town in America that went through this. I don't know where the real town is actually, but the fictional version is in West Virginia, like West Virginia needed any more horror after the Wrong Turn films. So Rose and Sharon pay a visit to this town, and this is where the plot gets a little bit crazy, because no sooner do they get there, they're transported to another dimension, which just happens to look just like Silent Hill. So they don't even realise that they've gone to this dimension at first. And this world that they've gone to looks really weird. It's all grey and white, and ash falls out of the sky instead of snow. It's like some kind of purgatory. But the real dangers come when it switches to nighttime, which happens in about 5 seconds flat, by the way. It's not like real life where the day to night transition takes about an hour. It happens in about 5 seconds in Silent Hill. But when it's night in Silent Hill, it's like this monstrous, hellish place. It looks like the bowels of hell. It's very difficult for anybody to survive once it becomes night. And Sharon runs away from Rose very quickly after they arrive in Silent Hill. So for the rest of the movie, basically, she's got to find her daughter all the time, just trying to navigate this weirdness which is all around her. Now, I will freely admit that part of my love for this film comes from the fact that I did play the video games. Like I said, this is a video game adaptation. I played the original Silent Hill in 2001. And I went on to play the original trilogy. There were some more games after that, but I stopped after 3. But those first 3 games, just absolutely brilliant. So when this film came out, I was really looking forward to it. But I like to think that I can still be objective. You know, there have been other video games that I've really loved, and I've not loved the movies. I used to love playing the Tomb Raider games, but I mean, the Tomb Raider films are fun for the most part, but objectively, they're not particularly great films. I don't own them on my shelf. Resident Evil is another series where I loved the games, but I mean, there have been some good Resident Evil films, some really good ones, but there's also been some absolutely terrible ones. In the case of Silent Hill, though, it's just an amazing film, this one that came out in '06. I do wish I could watch this movie having never played the games before, because that would be quite something for me personally. I still found it a great experience, even knowing a lot of the quirks and the monsters coming into it. There's an early moment where Rose is going down these stone steps and we get our first transition from day to night in the Silent Hill other dimension. And this siren goes off from somewhere. It's like, where the hell is that coming from? Is there some kind of old World War pole with a loudspeaker on it and the evil's just tapping into it? Or is this siren noise just literally coming out of thin air? But it's a freaky moment because the whole world goes dark. Rose has to use her lighter to get any sort of light, and then the whole world has changed around her. Like, wooden fences have become chain link fences with occasional dead bodies hanging off them, and sometimes she'll walk down corridors and the floor has turned into grates and she can see through it, and there's like these lava pits down below. It's just become this unbelievably gruesome world that she's trying to survive in, and the monsters are just incredible. A lot of them are adapted from the video games, it has to be said, so I can't give all the credit to Christophe Gans. The big one here is the Pyramid Head. I mean, if you've never seen this guy before, just go on Google, type in Pyramid Head Silent Hill, and you can just see how incredible he looks. He's got this like triangle helmet thing, he's really tall, he's carrying this sword which would put Buster from Final Fantasy, the Buster sword from Final Fantasy to shame, and he drags it along the ground and walks like an evil version of Jack Sparrow, but there's nothing comical about this guy. And what I like about the Pyramid Head in this film is that he's not overused. When he first turns up, you think to yourself, oh, this guy's going to be in it all the way to the end, he's going to be the big boss battle, but he's not. He's just in it enough so that if you do rewatch the film countless times like I have, then he's still freaky, and no shot of the Pyramid Head is wasted. The director just finds so many great ways to shoot him. Right from when he first turns up, there's a moment where Rose is sort of on the ground recovering from a fall or something, and the Pyramid Head guy just comes behind her, and I wish I could frame that moment and get a poster of it because it's just brilliant. And then there's a scene not long after that where Rose and her cop friend, Sybil, I think her name is, they get trapped in a boiler room, and just when they're trying to figure out what to do next, they hear this distant clanging of the Pyramid Head's sword as it scrapes along the floor, and it's getting gradually closer. It's just great horror. And there's also this monster who I guess used to be a human, but by the time that this story starts, he's become a monster because he's died. So his name's Colin and he's a janitor, and it's sort of hinted in flashbacks that he used to be a paedophile, but Rose accidentally comes across him in a toilet cubicle and he's dead, but he's been left in the most freaky position. He's got like barbed wire wrapped around him, which will come into play later in the story, and his legs have been bent behind him. It really gets the imagination going, trying to puzzle out just what happened to this guy when he died. It would have been nothing nice, but he comes to life and crawls out of his cubicle, and it just looks, it's really freaky, but it's also great at the same time. And I'm glad that they don't just have Rose bash this thing's head in just for a cheer moment, because, you know, this guy is clearly in hell. Just leave him there. And when Rose leaves the toilets, what I really like that happens next, the camera just cuts back to the bathroom and you see this thing, he's been crawling along, he just gives up because it's too much effort and just sits there and does a little wail. It honestly absolutely looks terrific. But what I like about the whole hellscape of Silent Hill is that it's not too disgusting. You know, I watched the documentary for this the other night, and they said about the monsters that they weren't trying to make them too disgusting, they were just trying to make them unsettling and creepy. And I think they succeeded not just with them, but with the actual landscape as well. Because if somebody told you to sit down and write a film where hell was going to be in it, basically, your first thought might be, oh God, I've got to make this absolutely horrific. It's got to be like those images in Event Horizon and the torture rooms from Hostel or something. It's got to really get people. Well, actually, maybe that's not the best way to go. Maybe it's best just to try and make it unsettling without have people going for the puke bucket, because this film is too ambitious to just try and make you feel that way. And if you thought the characters were going to get lost in this incredibly visual world, you'd be absolutely wrong, because there's some great characters in Silent Hill, both on the good side of proceedings and on the bad side. There is this evil cult of very human figures who turn up for the second half of the plot. Rose is played by an actress called Radha Mitchell. She's Australian in real life. I calculated her age as being about 32 when this film came out, and the character feels like a 32-year-old. It does make a change having someone like this as opposed to the usual woman in her early 20s. Rose is a mother. Her only goal is to rescue Sharon, but the way that they've written her in this, she's got just the right amount of bravery and an ability to kick ass when she has to, and vulnerability. There's a lovely moment where she breaks down in front of some school lockers and it's just all getting too much for her, and Sybil has to sort of pick her up off the floor. Speaking of which, that is another great character in this film, Sybil Bennett, played by Laurie Holden, who's probably better known for The Walking Dead. People always talk about characters in horror films making stupid decisions, not being sensible, but that is totally the opposite with Sybil. I mean, for me, she is one of the best characters I've ever seen in a horror film. She is very smart, makes very good tactical choices, seems to have really good intuition, as you would hope that a cop would have. I mean, her introduction to this film, she accidentally bumps into Rose and Sharon at a gas station when they're on the way to Silent Hill, and she just has this instinct that there's something wrong with the way that Sharon and Rose are acting, and she's absolutely right, and it's that instinct that actually gets her involved in this film. And then later on, when the cult members unexpectedly turn on Sybil and Rose, Sybil has the presence of mind to quickly shove Rose into this elevator so that she can carry on with the plot, and Sybil stays behind to just try and fend off the cult members. I mean, it's just brilliant, quick thinking. And then she does all this kick-ass stuff with the truncheon. She's waving it around, knocking all these guys down. This scene at the top of the elevator is just amazing. I mean, there comes a point where Sybil is outnumbered. She picks this gun up off the floor, and you can tell when you analyse that scene, she's not sure if she's down to 0 bullets or maybe 1 bullet, but just in case she has 1 bullet, she takes aim at the cult leader, who is absolutely an awful person, and she tries to shoot her in the head. Now, this is a cop, and as we know from Die Hard, you know, there are rules for policemen. You're not supposed to just shoot random people, but Sybil has just come to the decision by this point of the story, I'm in an alternate dimension. This is clearly a very sick, demented woman who's probably going to kill me in a minute. Yeah, I'm just going to shoot her in the head. And when she realises that actually, no, she didn't have a bullet, she puts on this little wry smile, like, yeah, I kind of thought I had 0. It's such an amazing moment. The thing is, Rose is going down in this elevator to this unbelievably tense scene with all these demonic nurses, which, I mean, I could talk about that scene for a long time. But, so you'd think the writers just coming up to this would not even think to have this other great segment at the top of the elevator shaft, but there it is. It's absolutely fantastic. And once we go back to Rose in the elevator, we then cut back to Sybil just being beaten on the floor. It's really sad. And that's not the end for Sybil. She wakes up a bit later on and they go to burn her to death in this really horrible way. And she gets this final great line where she says something like, oh, you're in your own hell, or something like that. Just love this character of Sybil and Rose. If there was some kind of poster with those two on it, it would be an absolutely fitting poster for this movie. There's another great scene involving Rose in this. It's quite near the end. Now, if you look at my thumbnail, I've deliberately chosen the moment where Dark Alessa resurrects Rose and she slowly rises up in front of this wall that has a picture of a bonfire on it, and it's such a screw you Christabella moment. She's the leader of the cult. This is not just one of my favourite moments in Silent. It's one of my favourite horror moments of all time. It's just wonderful. There's this organ music playing in the background. The soundtrack for this film is one of my favourite of all time as well. It's got all these clever little piano ditties. I think a lot of them have been lifted from the games, but they're just great. They fit so well with the sorrowful nature of the storyline and what Alessa in particular has had to go through in the events leading up to the movie. There's a great song that plays on the end credits as well. This really good indie song that I believe was originally on the credits of the 3rd Silent Hill game. Now, I will play devil's advocate a little bit and mention a couple of potential negatives for the movie. So like I said before, the plot does get a little bit convoluted, especially when Dark Alessa is giving all the big exposition stuff in the hospital where Lisa is sort of, this character Lisa's got her eyes burned out. There were people talking about the plot when I was coming out of the cinema, literally saying that they didn't understand this and that, and fair enough, but if you do manage to grasp what's going on with Sharon and Alessa in this town. It's a really satisfying story. The other thing that you could mention is the fact that we do a lot of cutting back to Sean's Bean's character, who is still in the real world. But what I love about these scenes is that they feel so different from the other dimension where Rose and Sybil and Sharon are. It's really vibrant and colourful in all the scenes involving Sean Bean. It's raining in a lot of those scenes as well. It kind of feels as a viewer that we're getting cleansed by that rain after spending so many scenes in all the grime and horror of Silent Hill. But on the whole, I absolutely love this film. I'm pretty sure that my passion for it is shining through in all this frothy rambling at the mouth that I'm doing for it. So let's get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score I'm going to give. You know it's going to be a good one. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bloody axes out of 5. For me, this movie is an absolute horror masterpiece. It's one of my favourite horror movies of all time. I could be on my own with this one. That is a possibility. I could actually be in my own weird other dimension with ash falling from the sky. Maybe everybody else is just in the real world watching the real Silent Hill movie, which isn't very good, but it's not my fault I'm in that alternate dimension if that's the case. Now, I will be back to do Silent Hill Revelations, the one sequel that they made for this. It's not as good as the original film, but I'm still looking forward to talking about it. So I'll be back very soon to review that. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.